Welcome back, folks. Now, there is a reasonable misconception in this country about what a binding referendum is. Most people, if you ask what a binding referendum is, I feel like the answer might be that Parliament, our government, is bound to that decision. So if let's say we have a referendum on the Treaty Principles Bill, that whatever the outcome of that bill is, the government must honour that, and they aren't able to change it unless we have either another binding referendum or they use a 75% majority in Parliament. Now, this is a misconception I myself admittedly held for a while until I went and did a little bit of reading about what a binding referendum is. And well, it's not as final as you may think. So let's take a look. So there are two types of referendums in New Zealand. There are binding and non-binding referendums. A non-binding referendum seeks the opinion of voters but has no legislative effect. Such a referendum puts a question to the public about an issue, but the government retains responsibility for deciding its policy response to the result, and Parliament determines whether and how the law should change. Pretty much this is whenever a referendum takes place and the law hasn't already passed through Parliament, that is a non-binding referendum. So a good example of a non-binding referendum would be the 2011 referendum, kind of assessing the public's mood to changing the electoral system again. So whether or not we're going to move away from MMP, and whether or not we supported, one, a change of our voting electoral system, and two, what would that system be changed to. And so that is a good example of one, because there was no legislation that was already passed through Parliament before that happened. It was simply a gauge of what people would like, and presumably, I suppose, if it was a majority of New Zealanders were keen on this changing, then they would pass through Parliament some legislation to that effect. Whether or not it would have had the support of all parties would have, been contentious for sure. Ultimately, people decided they wanted to stick with MMP, which kind of makes sense given this is 2011. We weren't even 20 years into our current electoral system, so that makes total sense. But moving on to a binding referendum. Binding referendums, on the other hand, are referendums that will have legal effect without further action from Parliament. They seek consent from the public for a change and place the final decision-making authority with the public. The outcome of a binding referendum may be implemented through a conditional commencement provision, where the legislation states that it will come into force only if a referendum has a specified result. Legislation that is conditional on a binding referendum must itself be passed by Parliament before the question is put to the public. So this is exactly what the Treaty Principles Bill was. It would have required, after being passed through Parliament, for the question to then be put to the public, where the public has a discussion and a subsequent vote on whether or not they support the proposed bill coming into force. If they turned it down, then it wouldn't have occurred. If they supported it, it would have been pretty much immediately enacted. And so that is what a binding referendum is. It has absolutely nothing to do with binding the government to an outcome in the long term, where they would need to go through the same process to change things. It simply means that the public are having the final say on whether or not it comes into force or not. A referendum in these circumstances is binding only to the extent that a law which has already been passed is automatically triggered, or not by the outcome. The referendum itself does not otherwise bind Parliament, though of course its result is of political and potentially constitutional importance. Any change to the law that results from a binding referendum is not protected from subsequent change or repeal by Parliament unless the law, as amended, is entrenched as a reserve provision. Conversely, Parliament would not be prevented from enacting a proposed law change that failed to be passed through a binding referendum unless the proposal affected legislation that was already entrenched. Now, this is what is important to note, that we have very, very few entrenched provisions. Very few. And so this bill was never going to be one of those entrenched provisions. None of the laws that we have passed in recent times through referendum have been made entrenched provisions in any way whatsoever. As it stands, if the Treaty Principles Bill was to pass at a binding referendum, it would have absolutely no impact on the ability for a future Labour government to come and repeal everything. Based on the conversations I've had with people online and even in the community, for me it's been clear that a big draw towards Acts Treaty Principles Bill was this whole idea that it would prevent a new Labour government coming in and reversing all of it. That it would prevent a Labour government coming in and putting us back on a pathway towards being treated unequally, on a pathway back towards racial separatism. And that Act's proposition here was the only possible way to ensure going into the future that we were protected. That it would protect us from this grievance industry that the Waitangi Tribunal has made, that it would protect us from these principles which have been used to justify treating people differently based on our ethnicities. It does none of that. All it means is that, at the very least, if it were to pass through Parliament, you get to have a say too. That's it. But to finish, I will quickly touch on some of our reserve provisions, what they are, and whether or not changes like a Treaty Principles Bill should be made reserve provisions, because if such changes probably should, given how important they are, and we probably should include things which aren't currently reserve provisions as reserve provisions. Certain parts of the electoral system are entrenched in law, requiring their amendment or repeal to be passed by a 75% majority of members of the House, or agreed by a majority of valid votes cast in a national referendum. The provisions that can only be altered in this way are known as reserve provisions. These relate to the term of Parliament, the membership of the Representation Commission, the division of New Zealand into general electorate districts, the minimum voting age, and the method of secretly voting. So I want to quickly go over that again. These are what reserve provisions are in New Zealand as they stand. The term of Parliament, which is something that is being hinted at by this government for having a referendum on next year, if not the subsequent election. The membership of the Representation Commission, the division of New Zealand into general electoral districts, the minimum voting age, and the method of secretly voting. That's it. The point being is we have so few provisions in our law that are actually reserved, that are actually requiring a referendum or a 75% majority in Parliament to amend. And that begs the question, why is the Human Rights Act not in there? Why is the Bill of Rights Act not in there? The more emphasis that you place on a particular piece of law, the more taboo it is to fiddle around with, the more taboo it is to propose law which may be questionable in the eyes of that legislation. So I don't think it's in the politicians' interests to make such a change, but ultimately it's something that should be changed. For me, I'd just like us to create a written constitution, and we reserve that. It can add all of the stuff in there, and then if we do desire to amend that constitution in any way, then we've got our methods of doing so. It just takes a hell of a lot of work. So that's a change that needs to happen. I'm not content with reserve provisions that they are. Look, ultimately, the point of this all was to dispel the misconception that binding referendums are in fact binding, and that they bind the government to a particular outcome in the long term. No, it just simply means that you as a New Zealander gets the final say on whether or not that piece of legislation is enforced or not. And ultimately, that's it. It's absolutely no different to any other piece of legislation in terms of its ability to be repealed or amended or whatever. So if you're someone who really only supported the Treaty Principles Bill over, let's say, an alternative because of this reason, it's not a reason. Whilst I do think the Treaty Principles Bill was a safer option, it was a option which was kind of more clear cut. It was very, very clear what the outcome would be from it. In the long term, that outcome is still unknown, because it would have been just as easy as Labour coming in 2026, 2029, 2032 and saying, gone. We're getting rid of that.